Does Pokemon have too many types? Well, in my opinion, no. But I think that there's much better questions that could be asked which provide a much more interesting discussion. For example, what even is a type? What is the role of a type? How should the types be different from each other? And most importantly for this video, what types are needed? The reason why I said that Pokemon doesn't have too many types is because Pokemon does a very good job of fleshing them out. Pokemon has had 30 years now to expand the types out and create their identities. Look at the Poison type. In pretty much any other elemental system, is Poison really worth giving its own type to? Especially when you consider that it's one of 15 at the very start. But in the first generation, it acts as the de facto Evil type. Pretty much every Pokemon from Team Rocket is a Poison type, and that gives it even more identity. In most other franchises, it wouldn't work as a type, but in Pokemon, it does. That's why I think that these other questions are much more interesting, as it allows us to look at types from a way that isn't through a Pokemon perspective, a perspective which has been warped for 30 years now. This is part of a video series where I'm going through my ideas of how I would create a creature collector, similar to Pokemon but without these shackles of continuity. That's why I want to look at types in this video, and ask which types are really needed for a creature collector. This video was brought to you by the good members of the Crustacean Association, Bilby and Finnegan Cleary. Thank you for your support. Vital to this conversation is what should a type be? What are types? Well, in my opinion, they're a grouping of similar creatures based on a theming, and they make up a key part of the in-game mechanics. The main part of types is that they provide a counter system. I personally believe that this is the most fundamental part of Pokemon. They also serve to provide you with different playstyles, with certain types being better suited to playing the game a certain way. In this way, types tell you a little bit about the creature that you're playing. You know that a dragon type is most likely going to be a very strong and powerful attacker. Without types, Pokemon would be incredibly boring. It would take away most of the strategy from the game. I think that types are the most fundamental mechanic in Pokemon. They're a great way to add both flavor and strategy to the game. The next question I want to ask is how many types should there be? And I think that this comes down to a question of two different philosophies. Should your type be very literal, or should it be very broad? Pokemon does a combination of both of these. For the very literal types, you have types like Bug or Dragon, where they represent very specific things. This to me somewhat limits the types of creatures that you're going to be using in these types. You can't get too out there with these types, as they are very finite. You can't really create a bug type that isn't a bug-like creature, and when you do get quite out there with these creature designs, it can cause a little bit of confusion. Most dragon types are restricted to being large reptilian animals. You're not going to get as much diversity within this type. But even then, it creates a bit of confusion, as suddenly you have Pokemon who are large reptilian animals but aren't dragon type. It creates even more confusion for newer fans. Bug is probably an even more egregious example. What makes a mollusk like a Selgor or a crustacean like Golisopod a bug type, even though an arachnid like Drapion isn't a bug type? Another set of arachnids, the spiders, are all bug type, but what makes them more buggy than their scorpion cousins, or even the actual bug, Flygon? These very literal definitions of types are just bound to create quite a lot of confusion. It's not just the Pokemon designs as well that are quite limited, but also other factors. How many flying type moves are just variations of hitting somebody with a wing? Rock and ground are so similar thematically that they share a lot of interactions. And how many fighting type specialist trainers are just martial artists? This is a major issue that the very defined types have. They limit creativity and they create confusion. You see it a lot in fan-made Pokemon types. Because Pokemon pretty much covers all bases already, you have to get pretty specific in the types that you're going to create. Types like nuclear, plastic, or food are so specific and would be really hard to expand on and create a fully fleshed out type in the way that water or fire is. I think that this is why less types is a much more appealing option. This is something that again, Pokemon also does. The grass type is not just representative of grass. In fact, there's very few grass types that are related to grass. It's also the type of flowers or trees or fungi or nature. This is just shown in the Pokédex of the type. the amount of different designs that are within the type. But you could also show it mechanically like the ice type does. The moves of the ice type represent the cold and harsh nature of the element. On the type chart, ice is represented as a glass-like, very easy to break substance. But in many of the Pokemon that represent it, they're showing it as a substance similar to rock or steel. This is something that I think a lot of fans get wrong when they think about the types, specifically in relation to the ice type. They think that maybe it should all be based around this brittle idea, or that it should all be based around this strong material idea, when in fact, it should really be a coalition of all of these. This way you don't really limit anything. Within a type, you can have various different subtypes or various different mechanics which allow you to explore different themes which are kind of relevant to that type. But it also means that there will be a much simpler type chart that you have to learn. Pokemon themselves does this within the trading card game, where they group types together in order to make it simpler, but also still allowing for smaller subtypes or thematic groups to exist. With the questions of what is a type and how many types should there be answered, we now have to ask which types are needed. I didn't give a number to that second question because I think you'd have to go through each type and work it out, rather than saying we only need 10 types and then making it fit. Out of Pokemon's 18 types, I think 2 of them stand out as being required. Water is the first pick. It's one of the most fundamental concepts of our world, and as the most abundant typing in Pokemon, there's clearly a lot behind it. One interesting thing that I found with the Pokemon type is that there's actually very few Pokemon who just represent the concept of water. Most of them gain a water typing through being some sort of aquatic animal. From what I could work out, there are only 6 Pokemon who are water type for some other reason that isn't because they're some sort of aquatic animal. And half of those are alternate forms who I don't even know if I should count, because then I should count Pokemon like Arceus Water. Fire is the second type that jumps out at me. It's the natural counterpart to water and is one of the 4 classical elements. As fire is naturally rarer, a lot of the Pokemon who have it as a type have it just added onto them. They might be a dog who has gained fire traits, or a bird who has gained fire traits. You don't get as many, oh, that's a real-life themed animal. A big part of this is that fire is very well known in mythology and fantasy settings. There is a lot that comes from stories and legend revolving around fire, and there's a lot to work off. These 2 types stood out to me. Pretty much every franchise is gonna have some sort of variation on these 2. They're very clearly defined. It's just to what level will they represent other things. The remainder of Pokemon's types I could definitely see there being some pushback against if they were included, but I think that there are 2 more who have a very strong claim. Some franchises like to forego an electric type, grouping it instead with air-based creatures for a lightning-themed subtype, or mechanical creatures to create a technological-themed subtype. I personally think that it has enough merit to stand on its own. Pokemon combines these 2 ideas, creating some synthetic and more sciencey themed electric types with the more lightning-based mythological type Pokemon. Whilst I definitely feel it could be included as a subtype, I feel as though it has enough to stand on its own. The same could be said for Ice. It has a lot of similarities with water, with them being literally made of the very same thing. However, I think that they give off very different vibes in terms of theming. The idea of just the cold, winteriness, and tundra-like climates gives you an extra different theme that you could play with. As mentioned before, Ice is a type of extremes. It's incredibly brittle, incredibly powerful, but can also be incredibly slow or incredibly strong. Out of all of the types that I did eventually go with, Ice was the one that I was most dubious about, but I eventually stuck with it as I felt that otherwise it would end up with too few types. You could very easily combine it with the water type, but I think you get much more out of it from it being a type on its own. The Ice label though is something that I'm not 100% sure on. I think this is one of the main reasons why there would be an argument as to why it should go with the water type. If it was called the cold type instead, I don't think you would be having this kind of conversation. Whilst these are the 4 types from Pokemon that I think could be directly brought into any other game, I feel as though there is one other type that is definitely general enough to move over with very minimal changes, and that's the Steel type. My main issue with the Steel type is its name. Steel has always felt like a very odd name, as it's a very specific alloy. The Steel type represents all metal and most mechanical things in the Pokemon world. So it's very weird that they went with just a specific type of metal. Not every steel type Pokemon is made of steel, and a few Pokemon even are named after other metals like Cobalion, Bronzong, or Copperajah. The metal type is a much better suited name that more broadly incorporates everything that the steel type represents. Some people will also say that steel doesn't really differentiate that much from other earth-like types. In Pokemon, this is kind of the case. Steel is very similar to the rock and ground types in the types of Pokemon that they create. But I feel as though there's enough to differentiate the two. Steel is much more mechanical and has some themes like industrialization or even a weaponry theme. Under a new name like Metal, it would definitely be a much more fleshed out type. The remaining types in Pokemon I think could have quite wholesale changes. Again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with how Pokemon handles these types, but as I'm trying to develop from the ground up, I'd probably want to do it a little bit differently. The main changes I'm going to make here are to merge together themes from different types, essentially picking and choosing different themes to create more fleshed out types. From the 13 types remaining, we're going to narrow it down to just 7. The most obvious merger is the combination of rock and ground types. One of these types has always felt redundant, and I always feel as though they should be one type. It's very unusual to see so many similarities between two different types. At what point do you draw the line between what is rock and what is ground? In Western media at least, these are almost always grouped together as a single category called something like the Earth type. I can only really think of Bionicle as something that differentiates them. If there's anybody in the comments who's a big fan of Japanese culture, which I'm assuming there might be quite a few of, judging by the fact that this is a Pokemon channel, could you please let me know if this is a Japan thing? Because a lot of the things that I tend to not understand in Pokemon generally are because it's a Japan thing. Does Japan divide a lot between ground or rock and see these as very different things? Because I would say that I definitely wouldn't differentiate them as much as I would poison and fighting. One of the only reasons I can think of as to why Pokemon did do this is a balancing reason. Rock and ground share a lot of similarities on the type chart, essentially doubling up on a lot of traits, specifically those traits revolving around the starter Pokemon. Was this a way to make water and grass stronger while also weakening the fire type? That's the only thing that I can think of. In terms of the themes that these two types tackle, I do think Pokemon actually does a decent job in differentiating them. Rock is a coalition of mineral-based Pokemon, stone-based Pokemon, and fossils, whereas ground is mostly made of less solid materials like clay, sand, or mud, with a lot of terrestrial animals thrown in for good measure. Even with this, I think that there's quite a lot of crossover. Look at Lycanroc. I had to look up what really made Lycanroc a rock type. It's these weird rock-like hair kind of things that it has going on for it. But to me, it just doesn't really look like a rock type because it's one of the few rock types that isn't just made of rock. It's much more similar to the ground types. A lot of ground types are either ground-based animals or there's some sort of animal that has been given a ground-like theme to them. The decision to make them different is especially unusual when you look at the first generation. Rock isn't really a defined type in this first generation. Every single rock type is a double type, and every rock that wasn't a fossil is also a ground type. Generation 1 did a really good job of defining what a ground type is, but didn't really do it with the rock type. It was kind of just a few ground types who had an extra type added onto them, and the fossil types. It's just a big grey area, and I think in most people's minds it would be the first type to go. Just combine the two together. Yes, from a Pokemon's perspective, this would create a really, really big type. However, I don't want you to look at it from a Pokemon perspective. Because Pokemon has separated these types, they have to create a certain number of Pokemon for them, hence why they would be such a big type. The normal type is one of the most controversial types in Pokemon. A lot of people think that it's very redundant, but I think that it's great, and that it plays a really important role in the game and the type chart. Normal is the beginner type. It is the type that represents the absence of a type. The themes that make up the coalition of normal type are a combination of generic creatures, Pokemon like Miltank or Dubwool, which are literally just animals, typeless Pokemon who are given the normal type as it's a placeholder type, something that allows them to not be associated with any other type very strongly. This is why it's used for Pokemon like Arceus or Castform, as these are Pokemon who change type, so need to start from a neutral beginning. Normal also has a lot of Pokemon who are mechanical based, who have some sort of other gimmick and have a neutral base from which they can expand upon. Komala is the sleep Pokemon, Slacking and Regigigas are drawback Pokemon, and Blissey is a Pokemon with a ridiculously high HP that you wouldn't really want to give any other type. All of these themes are really important, and I would definitely want to keep them within the normal type. However, I want to add to it to make it a bit broader. Fighting is one of my favourite types, but I think that it's one of the most limited types in the game. What is really the difference between fighting and normal moves, other than that they're performed to a high degree? Fighting is very similar to the well-supported sound type, in that I think it works much better as a category that spans multiple different types. Even in Pokemon you have moves that could be considered a fighting type move, but are represented by another type. Moves like the Elemental Punches or Blaze Kick. I think that if you were to incorporate a lot of the basic moves, those kind of moves that are just a punch or a kick, into the normal type, then you would be able to create a kind of martial subcategory of moves that spans underneath the types. It's really not something that I would want to do with the fighting type, as like I said, it is probably my favourite type, but I feel as though in a much broader category, it's one of the types that would have to go. After all, the entire game is fighting, so why do you need a specific type of it? Isn't that just normal? Starting in Generation 2, Dark replaced Poison as the de facto evil type. It serves as a coalition of evildoers, sneaky and underhanded Pokemon, and occasionally some generic bestial Pokemon that are a bit too wild and untamed to be normal types. The most obvious type to merge it with would be Ghost. These are the two sinister types, but I feel as though they have quite different feelings behind them. Dark is more real evil. It's tripping you up or laughing at you, whereas Ghost is supernatural. It's a much more powerful, otherworldly force. Instead, I'd like to expand on the themes that already exist, specifically the idea of sneakiness. From the fighting type, I think that you could incorporate a lot of those ideas of martial arts to make it much more of the ninja type. It's something that Pokemon's Dark type already has going for it. To add on to this, I'd also bring in some of the mechanics from Poison, to add in that idea of it being a very underhanded and sneaky type. Poison is a type that I think, while Pokemon has fleshed it out quite a lot, could also run underneath several types, similar to how I said with Fighting. Types like Bug and Grass are really associated with Poison, and you could even expand Fire, Metal, or Water types to have a kind of pollution-based theme around them. Finally, for Dark type, I'd want to make it the de facto Beast type of the game. Most of these ideas would come from the Dragon type, which currently shares a bit of the beast-like burden with the Dark type in current Pokemon, but I'd like to consolidate this within the Dark type, making it the type of evil, quick ninja-like attackers, and beasts. The other sinister type in Pokemon is the Ghost type, which is a very difficult type to develop. Psychic, Dark, and Ghost have always felt a little bit removed from the type chart, as though they're always on their own. As I mentioned before, Ghost could be an addition to the Dark type, but I like to think of it more as a counterpart to the normal type, in that it's the type of otherworldly forces. Because of this, I'd like to take a lot of the mystical elements from the Psychic type to make it feel more of the supernatural type. Both in Pokemon and real life media, the paranormal and psychic abilities have always been linked, so I don't think that it's much of a stretch to group these two together. They just feel very linked to each other. As for what to do with the remainder of the Psychic type, the more traditional magical elements of it, I feel as though they would work well in a newly formed Light type, alongside much of the iconography of the Fairy type. If Ghost is more sinister, otherworldly magic, and Dark is more physical underhandedness, then the Light type would represent goodness and traditional magic. Pokemon has often been at odds with which type is the magic type. Originally it was Psychic, but now that Fairy has been introduced, it also has a claim. This way, this is all brought into one type, and I'm going to add into it the heroicism elements of the Fighting type. This way it feels much more like a counterpart to the Dark type, It's a coalition of magic users, the righteous and the pure and the good-natured. Now, I haven't yet talked about one of Pokemon's starter types, the grass type. Much like the steel type, I feel as though grass is a bad name, and I feel as though nature would be much better suited to what it actually represents. It isn't just grass that it's talking about, and going with a more broad theme, this seems like it's much better fitted. As it's the nature type as well, I feel as though you could incorporate a lot of the ideas of the bug type into it. Bug and grass have always been very linked to each other, and it satisfies that need of trying to get rid of some of those more narrowly defined types, to help alleviate the burden and spread out the bugs so that they're not entirely in the nature type. I would also, as my final type, make changes to the flying type. In most media franchises, this is the air type, which makes sense as it's one of the classical elements, alongside fire, water, and earth. Pokemon takes this in a very different direction. It's much less elemental and much more of a physical type. I think that this one change really impacts how the type plays, as currently the type is so themed around birds that it actually impacts a lot of Pokemon. A lot of non-bird flying types will often struggle for moves, especially physical moves. Pokemon has made a somewhat weird, but still appreciated decision to have an air-based move category going across multiple types. Don't get me wrong, I like this change, but it's just very weird that the flying type is based around birds rather than an actual element. Those are the 12 types which I eventually reached, and I think that each of them is broad enough to feature a few subtypes, but also narrow enough so that they actually feel quite different from each other. But what about the types that I completely got rid of? Why did I specifically choose those? Some of them, like fighting, I think would be much better as an underlying category that goes across multiple different types. This was also what I thought of with poison. I love the poison type, and I love the idea of a status-based type, but it feels as though poison could be much more of a global condition which is spread across multiple different types. Dragon was one of the types that I was most conflicted about. It's sort of the ultimate type in Pokemon, on a different level to all of the other types. I considered doing something very similar with this, but in the end I felt as though it wasn't needed. Another thing that I had considered as well was creating a primal or beast-like type. This could include a lot of the elements from bug types, dark types, dragon types, and normal types all in one, but in the end I felt as though it wasn't as defined as a fire or a water type would be. Much like the other types, it felt more like an underlying theme. This is the 12 type system which I eventually diluted it down to. I definitely think that you could go even further. Water and ice are probably next up on the chopping block, and after that you probably have air and electric. But I think that 12 is a very good number to end on. Again, I'm not saying that Pokemon's system is a bad system. In fact, 3 of the types I've gotten rid of are my 3 favourite types, fighting, ground and poison. But I'm instead saying that if you were to come at it from a brand new angle, how would you do it? I also think that this system creates some quite nice pairings of types. Each type basically has some form of type that it's linked to. I don't know if that's specifically a me thing, but it definitely works in my brain. Any comments of this would be really helpful. But please remember that a main part of this is that I'm not trying to go entirely off Pokemon. So please try and come at it without those preconceptions. Do you think I could limit this even more? Or maybe you think that more types are more beneficial? What are your opinions on it? And I hope that over the course of this video, you think that I've earned a like or a subscribe. Thank you for your support there.